Hello, nerds and nerdettes, and welcome back to the channel where once again we have a new review slash overview for you guys on a recently released deluxe edition and also a book that you all requested to see me review, and that is none other than 30 Days of Night by Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith. This is a new reading experience for me as a comic book reader, since my only exposure to this particular title is actually the movie that is based off this comic book, but we can get into that during the latter portion of this video. A quick reminder that if you are looking for this book or any of the other books and titles I feature on the channel, to use the channel sponsor organicpricebooks.com, you can use the discount code STAYNERDY for $2 off your order, or when ordering 4 or more books, you can use the code STAYNERDY, ship it together to save 5% on that order. It's a great way to save yourself some money, but also to help support the channel. So thank you for those of you that do decide to use that code. But let's go ahead and get into the details of the book. So this particular deluxe edition does retail $34.99 or have a cover price of $34.99, and it does have a page count of 464 pages. So while it's not in the 1,000-page mark that a lot of Marvel or DC omnibuses kind of get into, it's still a decent amount of content, and I'm very excited to talk about it. So let's go ahead and jump into the book. And here we are, 30 Days of Night, the deluxe edition by Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith. You can take a quick look at the spine. We do have 30 Days of Night, deluxe edition, Niles and Templesmith. Make note of a volume 1. I don't know what content really follows after what's collected in here, but I assume there will be something, hence why we have a volume 1. But on the back we have a quick look at Ben Templesmith's art style, which is very unique to say the least, but fitting. And on the back we have Revisit the Vampire Tale that kickstarted a modern horror comics revival with its explosively fast and violent action. Great way to describe the story there. Fast and violent. But let's go ahead and take a look at the binding since we don't have any dust jacket. Here we are with the sewn binding. A pretty decent eye here. As you can tell, it lays down pretty flat. Almost kind of scary flat, because it does look like sometimes a page is going to rip out, but no gutter loss or anything along those lines, but still be a little gentle with these pages. All right, let's get right into the book. So we do have some black end sheets here, and then we do have a title page, 30 Days of Night, Deluxe Edition, Book 1. We do have a main character making an appearance here, but we can get into that later. Here is the table of contents, but also the creator of sorts. Let me shift this light here. So this does collect 30 Days of Night, Dark Days, and Return to Barrow, which are the 3 stories that are collected in here. They all do follow one another, so this is in reading order. The only thing that's really set between Dark Days and Return to Barrow is the 2004 annual, and that's primarily because it introduces you to some characters that will be making an appearance in Return to Barrow. So even with that annual being between the story 2 and story 3, it still is in reading order in my opinion. And then we open up to an introduction by Steve Niles, very lengthy introduction. He is one of the co-creators, so that's some important stuff there. And then we have the first title, 30 Days of Night. This is the title that was adapted into a movie, but the movie only covers 30 Days of Night, which is the first story of this series. So really, the only storyline that's going to be familiar to those of that have seen the movie is going to be this first story, but Dark Days and Return to Barrow are not part of that movie. There was a Dark Days movie, but it wasn't good, and it barely felt connected to the first movie, but technically there was one. But still, this is really the contents of the movie. But how this story kind of begins is in the town of Barrow, Alaska, on November 17th, 2001. We pick up with 2 main characters who are police officers of Barrow, which is Eben and Sasha, who also happen to be married. Eben and Sasha are the 2 main characters from the film as well. One of them, Eben, is played by Josh Hartnett. So that's why that name may be familiar to the fans of the movie. Here's a quick look at Ben Templesmith's very interesting art style, almost photorealistic when it comes to the face, but scratchy and gritty when it comes to the scenery and the setting that the scene's taking place in. Um, but really, how the story opens up is you do have Eben and Sasha finding a pile of phones, and these phones are the phones of the townsfolk of Barrow, and all of these phones are burnt to a crisp, unusable, and have all been gathered and set ablaze. That obviously gets them a little curious as to who would do that and why. We then open up to a diner in Barrow where a very odd stranger makes an appearance with some concerning words, which is a warning of a massacre and a event that is to come. And Eben and Sasha and a lot of the townsfolk of Barrow don't exactly know what he's talking about, but we are quickly shown what he's talking about when we find out that a congregation of vampires have decided to use the 30 days of night that take place between November and December as a way to hunt all of the civilians of Barrow. And that's obviously very strategic because vampires are allergic to sunlight and sunlight can kill vampires. So a time period of 30 days to hunt is very advantageous to the undead, and that is exactly why they chose to attack Barrow. So that's pretty much the synopsis overall. For the first story, you do continue. Here's a look at the undead here. You do follow Eben and Sasha and a lot of other townsfolk as they try to survive the onslaught that is to come. There is some other layers that we won't go too deep into, so you guys can read it for yourself. That has to do with the vampires and how their internal system kind of works when it comes to their population and their species as a whole and kind of the hierarchy that exists. So there is some stuff that is not portrayed in the movie that you guys can discover throughout these pages, which is always interesting. But it does, trying to not show spoilers or say any spoilers here, it does end very similar to that of the movie. So then we do open up into the next following story, which is 30 Days of Night, Dark Days. This does follow 30 Days of Night, and it follows only the character of Sasha, Eben's wife, and one of the two main characters from 30 Days of Night. Why that is, read to find out. But in this, you do have a tone change where Sasha is on the offensive when it comes to the vampires. She has published a book called or titled 30 Days of Night that reveals the existence of vampires to the world to try and get humanity to fight back. And obviously, as one would expect, vampires don't like that, even though it's not exactly a very effective method. I don't know the population that reads books, and then on top of that, the population that reads what we would deem as fiction books. Anyway, still, the vampires don't very much like that and do go after Sasha to teach her a lesson and stop her plans. Things definitely unravel from there. Things get a little precarious and interesting, and Sasha is a very different character than she was in the first story. Very badass, very interesting. Her character progression that takes place between the first story and the second story. But there is a very satisfying ending to that storyline of Dark Days. And then we have the annual 2004, which it's kind of a culmination of stories, but the first story is very interesting. It has to do with people not thinking rationally and kind of functioning off of groupthink and kind of acting in a manner where if you get kind of fear-mongered by something can cause you to really act out and not do very smart things. Very relatable. I do want to make note that this the annual specifically is kind of separating from my binding, so if you do have this, just be careful. You can see the sewn binding here, so it lays down flat, that's for sure, but just be careful. But the later half of the annual, you do get a introduction to a antagonistic character as well as two protagonists, the main of which being Brian, which we have his character being introduced here in the annual, Brian Kitika, which hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he is going to be the main character of our third story here, which is going to be 30 Days of Night, Return to Barrow. This takes the tone of the first story and the second story and combines them, where you have a survival, horror, but also a action-packed story. I very much enjoyed this story. It felt like a tower defense game, but featuring a actual story and zombies. Really fun stuff, though. Very gruesome, if you can't tell. This is not for children. There's a lot of violence. But you're going to get a lot of details throughout this story that pertain to the 30 Days of Night story, because the 30 Days of Night story is a very quick story, so some details kind of go unsung and unscathed, and through this you learn some of the nitty-gritty details through specifically Brian's journal, which is actually collected in the extras, and I do recommend reading if you kind of want to know more about how the 30 Days of Night went and what took place. But very action forward, and this story, while Brian is the main focus, you do have some familiar and returning faces from 30 Days of Night, and you do have a minor focus, even if it's not a main focus, of Eben and Sasha. So they are connected throughout this particular story. There's a theme that connects all these stories together. So that does wrap up all three of the stories. Obviously, I've stayed as undetailed as possible for those of you that do want to read. But here is Brian's brother's journal, the journal of William Kitika. Hopefully pronouncing that right. This is one of the extras I do recommend taking a look at. It is pretty lengthy. It's a journal. It's a lot of reading, but we're here to read, aren't we? But it does give a lot of details that you may have been kind of looking for in the first story. And then in the back half, you obviously get a lot of covers, some variant covers, more Ben Templesmith, incredible and abstract yet fitting art. Cannot talk highly enough about his art, but you also get some sketches also. So really good stuff overall, but we can head back to the table for some closing thoughts. And welcome back, nerds and nerdettes. So like I touched on a little bit during the overhead portion of the video, I did very much enjoy my reading experience on this particular title, and it did very much surprise me. I didn't have super high hopes going into this particular title, mainly because while I do enjoy the 30 Days of Night movie, I don't think it's critically acclaimed by any means, so I wasn't expecting a whole lot when tearing into this book, but man, was I surprised. So the first story is actually the story that the movie is based off of, which is the 30 Days of Night story, where you're going to meet our two main characters, Eben and Sasha, who are both police officers in Barrow, Alaska. They are going to be our main characters in this particular story, and really continue to be involved throughout this entire series and this entire book specifically. And that does include the following stories from 30 Days of Night, which is Dark Days and Return to Barrow. So you do have their involvement throughout all three of those stories. So they are very much important characters, but they are the main focus in only both of them are the main focus in only the first story. And overall, I think the first story was probably my favorite, if not my second favorite. I very much loved Ben Templesmith's art. It was very fitting to the tone of the book. It very much felt like a horror title. It felt gritty, it felt dirty and dark, and that's exactly what you want when reading a book specifically about vampires. I think vampires overall have been very much neglected throughout pulp culture, whether it's movies or shows or comic books, with the likes of Twilight or other shows and movies where the vampires end up being some form of monster hunter. In this, they are the monster. They are undead, and they are very brutal in their hunting tactics. And I very much enjoyed that. I don't get that very often in media or pop culture these days, so it was nice to get back to basics when it came to the vampire. As far as Dark Days, which is the second story, which primarily focuses more on Sasha rather than Eben and Sasha, I feel like the tone of that particular story very much switched into more of a action forward story, and I did enjoy that because it felt like I was reading a different story. They did not feel similar. It felt like a continuation but different completely, and I think that's one of the best aspects about this title in general is all three stories do feel very different, but they do feel in the same world or universe, and you typically want that when it comes to multiple titles. You don't want to be reading the same story or the same book over and over. And I did not get that feeling at all in 30 Days of Night, Dark Days, or Return to Barrow. So overall, very much enjoyed Dark Days and 30 Days of Night. Return to Barrow is probably the story that I go back and forth between either liking 30 Days of Night or Return to Barrow the most. Dark Days almost takes the tone of, or Return to Barrow, stumbling all over my words here, Return to Barrow almost takes the tone of Dark Days and the tone of 30 Days of Night and combines them. So you have a horror survival tone that was in 30 Days of Night and a action forward tone that was in Dark Days, but you have both of those in Return to Barrow. So it very much felt like a climax to the story, and I did really enjoy the ending, even though it was pretty predictable, but still I enjoyed it because I liked the characters that I was introduced into throughout all three titles. Return to Barrow, which is the third story, does focus on a new character named Brian Katika, which hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he is the new police officer or sheriff of Barrow, Alaska, which the town of Barrow is kind of still struggling with its vampiric friends, but with a little bit of a twist, and you can read to kind of find out what that is. Honestly, the only negatives that I would really give are primarily to the first story, which is 30 Days of Night, which felt very fast-paced. This story's supposed to take place throughout 30 days, but it felt more like 5. You blink and you miss it, and where it feels like a war of attrition type of situation, it didn't feel like that reading it, just because you get through the beginning and then you hit the end, and it just didn't quite correlate as 30 days or a huge struggle as much as it should have. But you do kind of get that touched on during the third story. So also another thing is that all of the nuggets of lore, a lot of the things that when you finish each story you're kind of asking for, the next story kind of does. So, for example, in 30 Days of Night, I wanted more detail to the 30 Days of Night. I wanted more detail to the vampires. And in the following stories, you get exactly those things. So you do have to be a little bit patient when it comes to those details. They are there, but I wish they were in the stories where I wanted them, if that makes sense. But Ben Templesmith's art is probably the biggest highlight of this particular title. It is very abstract, very untraditional, but extremely, extremely, extremely fitting to the story. And I think, honestly, his art really added a lot to this particular story and the tone and feeling and mood of this particular story. So kudos to Ben Templesmith on really selling this entire world and this dark and gritty story. Not that Steve Niles didn't pull his weight, but Ben Templesmith really hit it home. But the rating that I am going to give 30 Days of Night is going to be a 7.9 out of 10. I want more. I feel like this is just barely scratching the surface, and while I enjoyed it, I did have some minor issues overall. But if you are a horror fan, you need to read this. If you like vampires and dark, gritty, gory stories, you need to read this. It is a horror story first, and it is absolutely great to see vampires returned to their spooky and scary ways rather than what we have been seeing them as in pop culture and media in the modern day. But that does wrap up the review for today. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. You all requested to see this review, and right away I got to it and started reading this book. Very much impressed me. Obviously, it's not the best thing that I've ever read, but I am a hard critic on horror just because a lot of times I don't necessarily love horror comics as much as I love the tone and the genre and the story elements, but to scare me, it is kind of difficult in a comic book format. So I can tend to be a little bit hard on horror comics, but I'd love to hear what you all thought, your thoughts on this title. If you've read it, if you haven't, if you're a fan of the movie, whatever it may be, comment down below. But if you are not a part of the Illuminati, hit that subscribe button to join the community. Also, if you do me a favor and hit that thumbs up icon, it means a lot to the channel. And if you did enjoy today's video, you can hit that bell icon to turn notifications on. But thank you for watching once again. I appreciate each and every one of you guys. And of course, stay nerdy.